Okay, so we had a lot of attrition. So in fact, the fact that we have, and actually usually the folks tend to leave before the technical panel, not after the technical panel. Okay, so now the thing is, I'm hoping to get a few of the people who are still chatting, but in fact your votes will now count for more, because I want to do a quick straw poll. There's this issue with events like this that the breaks are never long enough. But it's always a trade-off between, do you want to listen to the panelists or do you want to have the conversation? So I just want to have a quick straw poll. Let's just take a binary first. So the choice will be, by show of hands, would you prefer the 15-minute break, which is what we've just had, or would you prefer a 30-minute break? So everybody prefer 15 minutes, show of hands? 15 minutes, right. Who prefers a 30-minute break? Okay, we're outvoted. Okay, so we're into panel 3, and after panel 3, we're just going to engine straight through and have a wrap-up discussion. Our moderator is the inimitable Bryan Tramont, who's managing partner at Wilkinson, Knauer. He's a great example of what Silicon Flatirons is all about. The thing that struck me about Bryan is he collects Lawyer of the Year awards the way other people collect baseball cards. So this guy, he was like, last year it was communication law. Like, what don't I have yet? Oh yeah, media law. I'll do that one. Bryan.
Thank you, I think. Anyway, I'm very excited about moderating this panel. The format that we've chosen, John didn't choose it because he only found out he was going to be on this panel 48 hours ago, but right. The rest of us, in his absence, chose for the panel is to have 5 minutes of overview from each of our institutional perspectives about the challenges faced in the spectrum enforcement space. And then we'll go from there for some questions from me and the audience and some interaction and take it from there. But we start off with Paige from NTIA.
So I think you're going to hear a lot of common themes from the earlier panels, which is a good thing. It means we're all thinking in similar ways that can help us drive progress moving forward. And I'll start by saying, 20 years ago, we would have never been able to predict the spectrum environments that we see today. And I can assure you, we have no idea what it's going to look like 10 to 20 years from now. But it's probably going to be more complex, more unpredictable, and more rapidly changing, which makes enforcement even more challenging. And forums like this are so critical to make sure that we can be prepared for that future. So I want to thank Silicon Flatirons for giving us this opportunity and continuing to put enforcement on the forefront of our discussions. And we've talked a lot about the growing need for sharing, making interference enforcement critical. I'll say it also makes interference avoidance critical. And we haven't talked a lot about that today. But building in interference tolerance, resilience is a key component to what we need to do in the future. And so this is a critical issue that policymakers have to address nearer terms. And the challenges are exacerbated by things like unlicensed, aggregate effects, also the federal, non-federal sharing, as we've heard before, and they become more exacerbated as we move to things like Internet of Things. And as we move to more dynamic environments, we need to be able to move from where we are today, which is largely reactive and static, to where we need to be in the future, which is much more proactive and dynamic, or I'll say automated. And because of the difficulty of addressing enforcement purely as a policy issue and the dynamic and complex nature of the subject, technology-enabled enforcement becomes even more critical. And so I'll say that the pendulum is swinging from the regulatory and process requirements to technology-enabled automated capabilities. And when I say enforcement, I'm talking about automated approaches for interference avoidance management as well as enforcement. So again, not just the end game and reactive enforcement. We also must define or change the policies and processes that will allow us to effectively implement those technologies. And that includes things like addressing the privacy and cybersecurity concerns that were mentioned earlier. A lot of great work has been done. We've talked a lot about CSMAC and TAC, and in particular, I'd like to recognize Dale Hatfield for his leadership and continued leadership in this area. It's been very important to us at NTIA to have his leadership. And it is a very complex and multifaceted challenge. It won't be solved overnight, but we need to continue to dissect it and address all of those challenges as well as opportunities. So in the past, I've used cyber as an analogy, and we heard another analogy earlier that John used. I think there have been a couple of analogies, but I think it's very relevant, so I want to repeat it here. If you look at NIST's cybersecurity framework, it consists of 5 concurrent and continuous functions: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Fundamentally, how do you know what's operating in the environment? How do you protect systems that are operating within the rules? How do you detect when an interference event is occurring, where it's coming from, who is doing it? What actions do you take to mitigate the problem? And how do you restore capability that was lost or impaired and prevent it from occurring again in the future? There are many discussions. Right now, it's predominantly a voluntary framework, whether things need to be voluntary or mandatory. But really, it's all about it's in everybody's best interest to do certain things to protect all of us. And this cyber framework relies on better information sharing among industry, among non-government players, as well as between government and non-government entities. There are formal and informal mechanisms that have been established to ensure transparency and trust, particularly in information and data. We've heard that on prior panels. And it's a model that I think we really need to look at, assess, and potentially leverage. An effective collaborative process between regulators, federal agencies, and industry to identify and resolve interference in a timely manner is very important, as well as to avoid it at the beginning. Now, similarly, the cybersecurity world has learned to implement technologies and techniques that effectively deal with ever-changing real-time threats, and those are both intentional and unintentional. Again, an area that we can learn from as we move toward a much more dynamic framework. This includes things like big data and other technologies and techniques. And we're taking steps in that regard. We've heard about spectrum access systems. There's also environmental sensing capabilities, ESCs, that are being considered to be implemented in the 3.5 gigahertz arena. We will learn, we will iterate on those nearer term implementations, but we need to be looking toward the future. Now, we can identify several areas in which progress has been made. We talked about some of those, like the SAS and ESC that I just mentioned. We have a better understanding of the complexities and the piece parts that we need to address through the good work of CSMAC as well as the TAC. But we really need to prove these things out. You know, we've framed the regulatory environment, as well as began the path to develop these technologies, but we need to deploy, test, build confidence that they will actually work, and that's going to be key, as well as test out the regulatory framework, the process, the policies. And then we have to establish a framework. I talked about the cybersecurity framework, and we can build, again, on what CSMAC and TAC have done, but we need a common framework, as well as then be able to identify the gaps and define the roadmap of how we get to where we need to be. And again, transparency and trust are critical. And this will also help us build the capability to have a seamless regulatory environment between the FCC and the NTIA jurisdictions in terms of sharing between federal and non-federal. So we're committed to working with the Commission and again with industry and the agencies to bring all of the stakeholders together and look at innovative and implementable enforcement approaches. We've taken an initial step. We talked about the 5 gigahertz issues with unlicensed and weather radar. And we're using that as a case study to look at some of the recommendations that have come out of the CSMAC specifically to see how those recommendations could have been effective in that case study, and we think that will give us a good baseline for moving forward. And as the U.S. moves forward with 5G, particularly in millimeter wave, I think it's just a huge opportunity for us to do it right from the beginning. We must take advantage of it, and because for enforcement to be effective in a dynamic sharing environment, it has to be embedded and pervasive. And 5G millimeter wave, even though a lot of work has been done, it really is just beginning, and we can build it in from the start. And overall, what that allows us to do is to help mitigate the need for regulatory intervention. And that's, I think, what we need to do in the future. So we have a strong heritage in the U.S. for technology and policy leadership and collaboration. We can take advantage of that, and we will. And this collaboration will create a virtuous cycle of research, development, and implementation that should accelerate our existing U.S. leadership in this area of spectrum sharing in particular. So the key to our success is collaboration, not only between government and industry operators and users, but also across research, development, testing, and evaluation. Collaboration and trust are essential for us to exploit the opportunities ahead of us and to provide greater confidence in enforcement moving forward. And I'll just mention a couple of other questions to think about. How do you build enforcement in? How do you incentivize good behavior? How do we ensure seamless and consistent regulatory framework? And then how do we ensure international extensibility? You know, we're talking a lot about domestic, but a lot of these issues are relevant and important internationally. And so we need to not make policy decisions in isolation domestically and internationally. Thank you.
Thanks, Paige. So I want to ask a couple quick questions, if I may. I know this wasn't part of our original dialogue. That's okay. The last part. No, you may not. You are the weakest link. Goodbye. International extendability. Are we at the cutting edge as a country on these issues? Is anyone else doing anything that you think is ahead of us or we can learn from, or are we sort of the tip of the spear, if you will, on these issues?
I would say we're at the tip of the spear. You know, when you look at how things are done internationally, particularly as you're adding new services into bands, it's all about protecting the incumbents, and they look at protection in a more static way, I would say. So I think we're really at the tip of the spear, and as the U.S. normally is, we're going to be leading the way.
So, and it dovetails into an earlier point you made about the importance of proving these things out, and that we've come up with some innovative ideas for different bands. How does one decide when it's been proven out? Is it a year? Is it 10 years? Is it 2 years? Is it 3 weeks? Like, how do we figure out, or is time the wrong way to think about it? How do you figure out whether something's been proven out and it should be extended to other bands?
Yeah, I think time's not the right metric. It's some metric associated with the confidence that we have in the technology and the process. You know, if you look at 5 gigahertz, that's been going on for the original dynamic frequency selection issues, that's been going on for years. Will we ever be done with that is one question. But I think it's really about getting to a point where we've established some level of confidence across the stakeholders that it's working well, working consistently, it's repeatable to a point where we're ready to accept it as our day-to-day activity. So I don't think there's one metric necessarily associated with it.
I do worry that people fall in love with the concept and then are eager to export it with that before the data actually comes in. So.
Yeah, and I think that's a concern that I have, is that we're already talking about employing SAS, spectrum access systems and other bands when we haven't really fully proven it out. We don't necessarily have to fully prove it out, but get to a point where we have confidence that it may be applicable to other bands, and it may not be.
Okay. John, you're up.
Yeah, so 48 hours ago, I learned that I'd be here today talking about enforcement. And of course, I think, you know, from a carrier hearing the word enforcement and talking about this, I'm like, what am I going to talk about enforcement for? What is this?
Travis LeBlanc is not here, you're safe.
So I was, you know, we're wondering what's going on. It's like, no, it's about spectrum enforcement. So then I got to thinking about, from our perspective, from T-Mobile's perspective, when we think about enforcement and from a spectrum I reflect back on the work that we did. I go back to the 90s working clearing the PCS band when that was first auctioned, and some things that we did there with the commercial sector and freeing some of that spectrum up. And then I think probably more so, that's probably more of what we're dealing with today is the federal, non-federal stuff. And then looking at AWS-1 and some of the challenges we had initially, working with federal agencies to clear the band and gain that confidence that, we're going to go in there, they have rights that we must protect. And so how do we find that balance? And what I found along the way was building that trust factor, the collaboration, working with the federal users really would go a long way. There were times when we were interfered with quite a bit after we were told the federal agency had actually moved out. But as opposed to going, I think, and running and trying to make a enforcement case out of an issue, what we found more productive was to go back, work directly with the federal agency. The wireless carriers network, it's easy to detect interference. We can detect at a sector level. So when we see noise come on the network, at a moment's notice, we can hone in on exactly where that's coming from. We have, through NDAs and collaboration with the federal agency, we have some of their assignment information. So we know, based off historical data, it's called the government master file, we can look at the GMF data when we see something come in and identify which federal agency might be the offender, and then go from there. And we've had times where we would talk to the federal agency, and they would swear up and down that it's not them, but once we would triangulate it in, you drive out to the location, take a picture, and send it to them, and then it was done. So, but I was thinking about this on the way here, and it's like, I don't ever recall in 20 years that I've been doing this, that I've ever taken an enforcement action with the commission on an issue.
Meaning you've never gone to them to ask for enforcement help?
To ask for enforcement help. And so I think it's probably important to define what does enforcement mean in that sense. And so, going on, I think you've got, the AWS-3 auction that just happened. There's going to be some sharing in that band, grandfathered systems we're going to have to work with. We're actually working with DoD right now on some satellite systems on how we're going to be able to share with those. But it's interesting because it was talked about earlier, you could put things in the rules and you could write a framework. Yeah. And we begin the process where we've established coordination plans. We're in the process of doing that now. But then questions have come up. What happens after the fact? You've got a coordination plan, both entities sign off on it. Let's say that the government decides to move, an earth station across the installation. And what does that do to the baseline in which you predicated how you were going to handle the interference? So how are those situations dealt with? Now, recognizing the fact that the government has a right to uphold their operations, and we must respect that, and we will. But it does bring up the question is if we're getting to the essence of true shared spectrum, that really means collaboration. And so it's incumbent upon both parties. If we're going to make changes to our network, we owe it to the government to show them that we're going to be adding more cell sites. We're going to put our network at risk. By the way, we accept all the risk for interference in that particular scenario. But the same would hold true for the government. If the government makes changes, it would be incumbent upon the government to inform the licensees so we can work together on and revise a coordination plan. So that's just one example. And when you look at 3.5, as Paige pointed out, and others have talked about the SAS system, I mean, obviously 3.5 is an attractive opportunity where, we look at it as 150 megahertz of spectrum, a three-tiered sharing framework. We look at that with a lot of promise, but at the same time, there's also a lot of reservation around what goes into putting a SAS together. Privacy information was talked about. How much information is disclosed? How is that information made public? There's part of that in the RNO. What type of information will be made public? And so working through those issues, you've got the cybersecurity aspects that you have to address. And then you've got the GAA component, which is essentially general assisted access. And so when you authorized access.
See, in this crowd, that's the problem, right? You
can't fix it.
Authorized access. So
this is why we're so much fun at cocktail parties.
That's right. So when you look at the GAA aspects of things, we've talked a lot about the transmitter. The transmitter. I think Dr. Chapin, hit it. It was the first time I heard it today in the panel, and I was glad to hear it. Was we hear 5 gigahertz. That's the interferer. He's transmitting. Let's go in. Let's hone in with the FCC Enforcement Bureau. We'll find out where the transmitter is coming from. But what about the receivers? What about the receivers? When we start talking about in 3.5 and the GAA and this stuff can be, as I think, Preston, you put it, it's going to be an international component. And we all recognize the challenges that we have in 5 gigahertz with some of the international equipment that comes in. I also appreciate the fact that it can't just be US based. And there's obviously a lot of value in international harmonization, and you want to promote that. But you also have to understand the challenges that come along with it.
I'm going to pull the plug on the 5 minutes, if I may. Do you have any closing points?
Yes.
The question?
I would just say on the receiver standards, I think is very critical that we take a hard look at that, particularly when we talk about IoT, something to 30 to 50 billion devices. When I think of low cost, consumer grade devices that are going to be out there for sensors, much of the things that Dr. Chapin talked about, I mean, who's building those? And how is the certification process at the FCC when they get certified? How is that playing out?
So, I think one of the hopes of the conference is to isolate the issues that are still problematic, right, and sort of clear away the ones that aren't. I'm hearing that from a T-Mobile perspective, licensed spectrum with other licensed users or government users, no problems with enforcement. At the end of the day, you know who they are, you go to them and figure it out. Has T-Mobile ever how eager do you think T-Mobile will be to invest in a regime that looks different than that, like the 3.5? And what are the variables, like, to go back to Paige's question about how much proving out will there have to be before you'll be willing to invest in something like that, or risk your customers' wrath, right, if they have a bad experience, which is effectively what that means when you're going to invest, right?
Right. I think it'd be a crawl, walk, run approach to the 3.5. As I said, it's 150 megahertz. It's an attractive offering. I think, we're very interested in it, and I think we are open to looking at how we can make that spectrum work under that, three-tiered SAS framework. And so we're open-minded to that. I will say that we do have those concerns. And to your point, yeah, licensed spectrum, carrier to carrier, carrier to government, we've done that. I think we've perfected that. You're always going to have hiccups, but I don't think that's the issue. I think it was enlightening for me to be here today just to listen to, others talk about it more in the IoT context, and how that really is where the enforcement discussion, I think, really needs to come to bear. And again, I think it goes back to how do you define enforcement?
Yeah. So RICS members have a much more complicated sharing regime that they've had to deal with. So, all right, Mr. Kaplan?
Sure, thank you. Broadcasters really do play a critical role in the conversation around sharing, and in many regards, because we've actually been doing it for quite some time, and in a variety of capacities and aspects. The conversation around sharing often, exploded sort of about 5 years ago, and I think everyone sort of got ahead of themselves in a very academic way. I recognize we're at a law school, so we're going to take an academic approach, but also it's important to apply theory to practice, and we have a lot of that practice really in 2 areas. One, and they're really interesting case studies. One is in TV white spaces, so between TV channels where there's space, no stations operating. The FCC in 2010 sort of finalized rules so that there can be unlicensed uses there. And I can talk a little bit about, as we go on, talk a little bit about that experience, and that was a government mandated sharing. And then we are now on the brink of embarking on sharing with the Department of Defense. This was sharing that we initiated with the Department of Defense to free up the spectrum that became AWS-3, that auction that raised over $40 billion. It required the Defense Department to move, and they had to find a new home. We have operations at 2025 to 2110. It's mostly sort of emergency news gathering. So breaking news outside the campus here, a TV truck will go out there, and then utilize that spectrum. And that's obviously difficult sharing for us because we don't know where and when it's going to happen. So each sharing case will be different. In that instance, it's quite difficult. However, there was acknowledgement with the Department of Defense that they needed certain sharing on testing on military installations and things like that. So maybe that's a good fit. And so we've been working with them, not mandated by the government, suggested perhaps, as the word I'll use, but embraced by both broadcasters and DoD. What we did is we created a framework, crossed our fingers, I think initially, and hoped it would work. Not like fingers and toes, that we didn't mean it. The kind of the kind where you're like, geez, I hope this works. But actually have a very productive conversation since developing that framework to actually put it into practice, and now we're undergoing testing to see how the entire framework works. So two different things that I can address today, and two different ways of doing it, and I think they're instructive as to how we should address the question of this panel, which is markets versus regulatory institutions driving the conversation and the rules of the road. We've learned three things that I'll just touch on briefly. One is that we should all be very cautious when it comes to sharing. And it's not a tactic for delay or to throw a roadblock to sharing. Sharing is obviously a critical feature for spectrum policy going forward. But it is so important that we understand what we're working with, the particular type of sharing. Is it time, place, what kind of sharing it is? Because I can talk about the TV white spaces experience where I think we've gotten lucky, where the FCC, and I could take partial blame for this because I was there when this happened, created a regime that clearly wasn't workable for TV white spaces in terms of ensuring that there wouldn't be interference. They developed a database that was populated by the users as opposed to, so Paige talked about having automation involved. They declined to have automation, the FCC did. And so what happened is you could fill out basically where your location is. So you might be in New York City, there may be not any available channels, but you could say, I'm in Wyoming now, and just put that down, and suddenly you'll have all these available channels to you. And there was no way to check that except ex post after the interference. And again, it's users we're talking about. We're not talking about T-Mobile and a broadcaster or sophisticated parties that can work it out. We're talking about potentially millions of users. Really, the only thing that saved disaster with TV white spaces is that it hasn't worked yet. The business case hasn't proved out, and so all the billions of dollars of investment that everyone predicted would happen never happened. And so luckily, there's only a couple hundred devices out there, so we narrowly avoided something, but we've filed in 3.5 and other proceedings to ensure that folks are aware that this is a problem that needs to be fixed. So in this case, it would be automating putting geolocation in the devices. Simple fix. Again, not a roadblock, not something that you can't, there's no way you could do sharing, but fixing different regimes. The second one is, point I'd like to make is just on trying to fit square pegs into round holes, mandatory sharing. It's really important to think about who are good sharing partners, what makes sense, and not as we rush to figure out how we create policy where we can make the maximum efficient use of spectrum. You really got to ensure that you're finding folks who can work together to make sense, and the government just coming in and saying, hey, you two need to share and figure it out, that's a challenge. So it's really finding the right pairs. And then third, it's been talked about ad nauseum, but I can't emphasize it enough, and I'll add a different spin to it, which is enforcement. Self-enforcement is obviously great, and I think what John said is absolutely right. Broadcasters frequently will run into issues. When 700 megahertz came online, there's going to be issues, and sophisticated parties can find ways to work together first and typically are able to resolve it. So we should have a lot of faith in that system. At the same time, when you're talking about users generating the interference, so especially in the unlicensed context, you're going to need a cop on the beat. And it's funny, and a comment was made here earlier, one of the few times I've ever seen many industries rush to say, hey, we need more FCC field personnel out there, we want more regulation, is when the FCC talked about getting rid of field office personnel. And they did, and they ended up not cutting it back as much as they would have. But we felt that was is going to deal a devastating blow, and David, he worked quite a bit, and thanks to the work of David and his boss, it prevented, I think, what would be disastrous. But as we move to more sharing, you do need, I think, to have a robust presence in the field from the FCC. The FCC, I feel like, has gotten kind of way away from its core mission of resolving interference disputes, ensuring that folks stay in their lane, and heavily into policy and things like that have nothing to do with this. Now, it could walk and chew gum, so it could do both, but the concern is that we don't want the FCC to walk away from that role, which is to ensure they're in the field, and making sure that all users feel comfortable with the regime. And with that, I'll turn it over.
Great. So you're terrific in focusing on sharing and enforcement issues, which is what the focus of the panel is. But I do feel like we'd be remiss if we didn't talk briefly about a more traditional enforcement matter that has plagued broadcasters for decades, and that's pirates, right? So that's that I think in many ways could foreshadow what we might see in spades 3 years from now, 10 years from now, as more and more rogue users get out there and start to use the spectrum without an effective enforcement tool. So if you just talk a little bit about the pirate experience
Absolutely.
and your experience with trying to get the FCC to take action against unauthorized users.
Right, and although pirates are not an acronym, we'll say it's not, they don't have a patch over their eye. And,
Some of them might.
these are
They
the
never
yes,
can tell.
that's right. We've seen a few. These are folks who are operating in an unlicensed manner, unlicensed spectrum, broadcast spectrum. And there's a lot really concentrated heavily in New York, Miami in particular. But this is, again, is an area, I'm glad you raised it, Bryan, where the FCC has not shown an appetite for enforcement. It does a little bit here and there, also doesn't have all the tools it needs. But this is not something that the sort of wireless companies haven't had to deal with as much yet, but I think over time that will become a bigger deal. As it proliferates, so here, one of the reasons we hear that the FCC doesn't enforce, illegal operation on radio stations as much as it should is because they don't have the, manpower, bandwidth to do it. Well, what about in 3.5 or somewhere else where there's, again, millions of users out there, and some of them operating either faulty devices or just because they're not adhering to the rules of the road if you don't have them automated? Who can possibly handle that? So I think the pirate radio example, Bryan, is a great one where it can become overwhelming, and that's actually a pretty narrow one when you don't have many uses and they're confined to certain cities. And even then the FCC struggles to enforce.
Well, the pirate thing's interesting too because the goal of a pirate radio station is to be heard. Yeah. So therefore it's open and notorious to the public as opposed to other types of uses which may not be, where the intention is not to get people to listen but rather to communicate on specific data on specific channels. So it's a very interesting challenge, I think. Mr. Redl.
Bryan. Well, I'm last, so I'll try to be brief. And I'll try not to repeat what others have said. So I'm going to skip past the licensed stuff that people have already talked about. I think focus more on, coming from a commerce perspective, where we are in the House Energy and Commerce Committee, look at what amounts to the clash of cultures and the incentives and expectations that are different and causing challenges when you're dealing with those who are making spectrum access their core business and for those whom spectrum access is ancillary to their core business. And you really see this in two particular ways. The first is when you're looking at companies who have sold devices into the marketplace and have no ongoing relationship with the device. And we saw this play out when Light Squared, now Legato, wanted to get into the GPS space. And I think for those of us that play in this space, we're all very familiar with that. But we saw it play out in that the incentives were there for GPS devices to use, in some cases, sloppy receivers. And frankly, there was very little incentive for GPS device manufacturers to increase the cost of their device by using higher quality equipment that would enable someone else's business. We saw that play out, and it's continuing to play out in 1.5. And we have yet to see sort of a resolution of this in a way that both sides can get what they want and see economic benefit. And this is where you've got that one side of the clash. I think the other side of this clash of cultures, when you've got that, we're seeing play out, and this is where I cannot believe we're all the way to the third panel and no one's been on the LTE-U Wi-Fi fight yet. So I'll be the guy. We're seeing
we are at the home of Cable Labs. Maybe
no, I know. And where's Alderfer? He was over there. I'm afraid to start throwing things at me. We're seeing this play out in Wi-Fi and LTE-U, right? I mean, ultimately, LTE-U is being pushed by carriers whose primary business is providing access through spectrum, and Wi-Fi is being promoted by companies who use spectrum access as secondary to their primary business, primarily cable, and folks who are edge providers of internet services. And the incentives and expectations are all wrong, right? The incentives to provide shared access in a medium where everyone expects to get the whole thing, right? Customers of Wi-Fi expect it to work. They just do. providing a system where you might have someone come in and provide somewhat of an interruption to that system, right? LTE-U, no matter how nice it gets along with Wi-Fi, and I think there's a debate, and if you ask the carriers, they'll say they get along great. You ask Wi-Fi guys, they say not at all. Ultimately, they're sharing one medium, and somebody on the Wi-Fi side is going to get less spectrum, potentially, because there's new people coming in. This, of course, was the design of the unlicensed band, to let people come in. And the challenge we're facing now is how do you make the economics square? This was supposed to be an innovation band, but we're not dealing with a technological question. We're dealing with an economic question. We're dealing with a PR question. Consumers will not stand for their Wi-Fi to be disrupted. And so you have a legal question that should be very straightforward at the FCC. This equipment complies with the Part 15 rules. Please authorize it. But it's not getting authorized because people are concerned it will disrupt Wi-Fi. That's not how the law works. Unfortunately, what's happening instead is that we have a lot of PR, particularly on the Hill. I will own this on Capitol Hill. We are certainly not immune to constituent calls. Nobody wants to have their boss get inundated with calls from constituents who are upset about an issue. And this is one that has been raised in the public consciousness. My members get calls on this every day, which if you had asked me 10 years ago when I started working on spectrum policy, if you would get my parents who are almost in their 60s now asking about LTE-U, my parents don't understand how their phone works. So when I get those kinds of questions, I know something has hit the mainstream in a way that it changes this from being a technical discussion to being a social discussion. And I think that's where we're seeing a bit of a market and legal failure, is that this is no longer happening in the domain of technologists and engineers and lawyers. It's happening in the domain of journalists.
So what does that argue for? So we saw may as well do the garage door opener example, where our friends in the government user community had to adapt to the embedded base of consumer devices there. We saw it in 902 to 928 when there was the license service. Now I forgot what the original acronym. Help me. Anyway, 902 to 928 with the license service that was originally supposed to be for the for cars and the toll reading and stuff. LMS, I believe. What do you do when you have an embedded base of users that's relying on unlicensed? Is it just that they should never have relied on it and we have to do a better job of educating consumers? Is it there should be no such thing as unlicensed because a lack of interference protection is a non-starter? Like, where do you land in that conversation?
Oh, Brian, if I had the solution, we wouldn't have been doing this for the last couple of years. And in full disclosure, we've been having a lot of discussions on this issue with both sides of this debate, with the Wi-Fi folks and with the carrier community, to try and find a way to square these equities. I mean, the reality is everyone should be able to experiment in the Part 15 bands. But we also have such an embedded base of users that customer expectations won't support the idea that you can just see something go away. I mean, the reality is I will own that I am as big a part of this problem as anybody. I dragged out an old 802.11b router the other day because I was like, you know what? I just need to plug this thing in to test something out. And of course, it completely ruined use of 2.4 in my house. It just did. It's terrible. It's old. It's leaky. It's a problem. But I knew that I had pulled it out at work, and I probably screwed up my neighbor's Wi-Fi in the process. But that's the way that system works. And I don't know that there's an easy way to square that. My concern is that as we look at SaaS, and this is sort of the next step of this, we are pitting those two folks head-to-head in SaaS. I don't think SaaS is going to be a question of whether the technology works. I think what will be interesting to see play out is whether there's an economic case for people to buy licenses, and whether we're going to have an understanding of users in 3.5 that if you are in the unlicensed piece, it may not work as well as you'd like if enough people start buying GAA licenses.
So based on all that, so I was struck by what Rick said earlier. He said, luckily, white spaces hasn't really worked, and there's only a few hundred devices. So does that argue that we never should have tried white spaces because once you inject it, you can't unring the bell?
I mean, you're going to make me dig back to my old days as a wireless advocate. It was one of the few places that CTIA, when I was a CTIA employee, and NAB were in 100% agreement, was that the white spaces was going to be challenging for particularly this reason. Once you put devices out into the marketplace, into people's hands, and there's no connection back, and you have a problem with a licensed service, there's very little remedy other than getting somebody from the FCC to go out with a spectrum analyzer and find them and tell them to turn it off.
So completely unfair question. We're not asking on behalf of T-Mobile, but should we have tried white spaces or not?
Well, I mean, look, I think trying new technologies, there has to be, a field for innovation, and I think you have to try.
But is it next to the embedded base of broadcasters, and all the customers who rely on it?
Well,
I'm channeling you, Rick.
I mean, look, I totally agree. I mean, white space has not been a success as some had envisioned, but look, you are going to fail at some ventures when you look at innovation along the way, and so it's interesting to second guess it now, but I guess maybe another way to look at it is what can you do to fix it? I mean, if the genie's out of the bottle on it, what are you going to do? It's already embedded, it's already out there. Maybe a low proliferation rate, but maybe take a look at how you're going to fix it.
Well, Bryan, I'll throw it back, right? We've talked for how many years about, well, okay, instead of doing this blanket unlicensed, maybe we should do spectrum manager models, right?
Yep.
Is that a solution?
And is that a solution because of enforcement? Is that the way, and to tie it back to our point?
Because you've always got somebody to come back to. I think more importantly, you've got somebody that's, not only someone who's managing the system, but who's acting as a de facto standards body. I mean, if we instead said 2.4 is the 802.11 band, that'd make things a lot easier, but it would also harm innovation in people that wanted to try in that band.
Now, Rick, as I recall, but you can correct me, the white spaces database manager, at one point NAB had talked about a strict liability standard or some sort of liability standard being assigned to the database manager. Would that, in your mind, fix it?
Well, that could be one way, right? So white spaces really was sort of the worst of all worlds, where there was no responsibility among anyone, whether it's, you're obviously not going to go after users. You're not going to go after, they didn't assign any, responsibility to the database managers. When we talk about database, I'm going to, and you could do this. I mean, you can enter, go to the white space databases. Right now, you can enter, I'm in Belize. I want to use it. And, again, you're set to go. And so, but the database manager has no responsibility under that regime to ensure obvious errors like that are even correct. So it's sort of a big hole. And I think one way to deal with this is also to do more pilot programs. Not just, white spaces was really policy driven. It wasn't, it was a big food fight on a policy level, a PR level, you might want to call it, whatever else. It wasn't really, and so when I was at the commission, we were really cobbling it together to make it work to fit the policy goal of innovation, which is a great policy goal, but ultimately, again, didn't work. And fortunately and unfortunately, I mean, it'd be great if white spaces actually really proliferated and was terrific and respected interference. In this case, it wasn't developed under that model. The FCC is trying to fix it, but I think it's important to assign responsibility, so that you know where to go if there's an issue.
Anybody I feel remiss, and because we have a lot of white spaces folks in the audience. Is there anybody who would like to weigh in on this as an audience member? I'm open to that possibility. Sure, go ahead. Can we run the mic down real quick, just in fairness?
So
Identify
I'm
yourself.
Dan Lubar,
Yeah.
and I just wanted to let Rick know that he's absolutely right about what happened in the U.S., but innovation finds a way, and if you look at it carefully, that marketplace is now offshore. They're offshore in places that there isn't a ton of broadcast television. There is some, and believe it or not, those places do have, most of the broadcasters are embracing this idea that you're getting two-way television, if you will, or broadband along with TV. So the U.S., tough place to try to do it. But I did want to make one comment about sharing. It's a really hard band to try to share because of the characteristics of the spectrum. No matter what you do, the physics of the stuff is a lot more important than the politics and the market economics. So that was the other comment I'd make.
That's true. And white spaces as a concept is not a bad one. I mean, it's a good one. It's with the best of intentions.
Right.
And in fact, the technology, I'm not even sure that, I can't really speak to the technology, and that's part of it, is that like dynamic spectrum access, things like that, it's good to jump around different places. It's the regime the FCC created. So this is really, it's not really anti-white spaces. It's careful thought about the regulatory regime. And frankly, we didn't realize it until after, when we started combing through the database,
Right.
By accident, really, that there's all these entries that were so patently incorrect. And we started saying, well, why is that? How could that be with only, few hundred entries. It wasn't like they were buried. It was 20% of the entries were just on their face wrong. They were in places where there couldn't possibly be these devices, and that's when we realized, as Bryan well knows, that it's because users were entering where they could go, and a lot of them were just tests. So again, the deleterious effects were not as bad as they could have been, but that was a good moment, I think, for all of us to pause and say, okay, how do we get it right before we do something like white spaces to get white spaces right, which I do think there's a way to do it correctly.
Although I would posit it wasn't necessarily the right approach. It was the right approach the FCC had the authority to do. I mean, white spaces is part of what led us to incentive auctions. White spaces was about maximizing the inefficient use of spectrum.
That's right.
Incentive auctions are about minimizing the inefficient use and instead getting the maximum use out of the band. It was about compressing broadcasters into as small spaces as needed for broadcasting and reaping the dividend, instead of saying, we've got this inefficiency, what do we do with it? How do we make lemonade out of these lemons?
I think you might have just been lemons in that, Rick. But so there was John made an earlier observation that was super interesting about we sort of have we have analog agencies in a digital age for enforcement purposes. And we're going to start with David. How do we get from an analog set of agencies doing enforcement to a digital set of agencies doing enforcement, and what would that look like? So we've talked a little about the field, talked about having cars around, we've had spectrum analyzers. Is it that we have a car in every city that has, how do you think about that from a solution perspective?
Well, I mean, as Rick hinted, my boss, Chairman Walden, and Chairman Fred Upton, my two bosses back at Congress, felt pretty strongly about keeping folks in the field for the FCC. We love to talk about shrinking the size of the Federal Communications Commission. I think if you asked, could we just move them out of Washington, D.C. and into places where they can help solve interference problems, we'd probably be okay with that.
Probably get a lot of people to come to Boulder, I suspect.
I would imagine that is the
Taking
case.
applications, yes.
I think, I will admit that I don't have a silver bullet here, but I think increasing cooperation between the commercial sector and Paige's folks would be a big part of that. Non-FCC government users are literally everywhere, physically and in the bands. Helping find ways to do that doesn't impact their mission and doesn't impact national security, I think would be a way for us to increase visibility into challenges moving forward.
Any quick reactions to the black box requirement for transmitters or the license plates or any of the other things we talked about earlier?
I mean, my first reaction when I heard that was if I had proposed that in Congress, the privacy folks would be very upset right out of the gate. I think that's a real challenge, dealing with the intersection between privacy and anonymity, particularly when you're dealing with internet access. Is a real challenge when we start looking at enforcement mechanisms in spectrum. As we move more and more into a wireless domain, folks are really cognizant of how they're being tracked. We hear a lot about that. I mean, we had the Stingray question earlier. So I think there's a real challenge to be solved there. Again, if I had
is there anything that you heard in the earlier panels that you'd say, oh, we should try that?
No.
Rick? Just get to the bottom lines here,
All right, so to qualify that, Bryan, no, because my bosses pay me to look at what we should put in statute and should be something that moves forward.
Like more money for the field.
So I don't think any of these solutions are something that we should all be saying, this is the solution, we should ensconce this in a statute and move forward with it. I think there's a lot of room for experimentation on those fronts, and we should be trying to experiment on those fronts, but let them compete with each other to see which one makes the most sense.
More money for the field for Charlie?
That's out of I'm an authorizing
committee.
Come on, I work for authorizers.
I made a run. Okay, go ahead. Rick?
I think it's a combination of what Paige said earlier. As much as can be automated as possible is essential within the devices that are being used. And then, I'm not part of the authorizing or any committee, and I would say more money for or reallocation of resources within the FCC to really focus on what I think is their core mission in resolving interference disputes.
Okay, to bump up reg fees a little bit to pay for this?
Not from us, because they haven't changed the media ownership rules. So when they do that, we'll talk.
I mean, a point was made earlier about DFS, right? I mean, despite the 5 gigahertz challenge that you have there with dynamic frequency selection. So implementing that, I think one of the questions that came from the audience was how, yes, it has its challenges, but a lot was learned from that. And so I think to discount the technology aspects of how you can solve some of these interference mitigation techniques would be short-sighted. I think there is a place for technology, but there's also going to have to be, I think, a policy review. And getting back to what I said earlier, when you start talking IoT, 50 billion, devices, low cost, consumer grade, receiver standards.
So I want Paige to close it out, and then we're going to turn it over to student questions.
Yeah, I want to expand on something that David said. So there is a lot of capability out there, whether it be NTIA, FCC, the agencies, industry. And I think one of the things we have to do is figure out how to federate those capabilities. And then there are a lot of issues associated with that in terms of bringing in data, sharing data, et cetera. But I think we can get a huge benefit from that nearer term. And this will evolve over time. I think it's essentially we will not be able to keep up from a real-time perspective. We can't have man in the loop. And so we will have to look at I'll call it an architecture loosely, of capabilities that are, again, embedded and pervasive. What that looks like, not totally sure. But I think we can make improvements nearer term by federation, and then longer term by embedding technology that's pervasive that we can take advantage of.
All right, questions from our audience, students, or Dale first, and then we'll go students.
I was just going to ask Rick, but you just.
And make sure you identify yourself, I'm sure.
Dale Hatfield. Rick, when you started listing the two experiences that you've had with sharing, you skipped over a third one, and I'm kind of curious how it worked, because it's 470 to 512, which you're sharing with public safety. And that's sort of static sharing and so forth, but it is public safety. And I was curious about what your feelings about how well that's worked.
So I think it's at an equilibrium. I think it's worked over time, and as you said, it's static, which makes it easier. There's just certain areas that are cut out that that where broadcasters won't use, and that's in some ways maybe the easiest kind of sharing, as opposed to many of the dynamic things we're talking about. But you're exactly right, and that I think was a good first step, and over time it's just been incorporated to the way people think about the broadcast band.
Student question? I'm in the back.
Thanks. Mark Charman, president of Innovonics here in Boulder County. Not a student, but we do sponsor a number of programs here.
So you're using their chit. You can just pass the microphone to some of my former students behind you when you're done, and they can do that.
Mike, I'm interested to have a comment on why I may be the only one that sees this elephant in the room, and maybe it's not one for that reason. We talked very briefly about unlicensed spectrum, basically just bounced off of it, and talked even way more by a multiple of 5 or 10 about white space and its failure. And yet the conversation content is really about interference mitigation and enforcement. Having been a participant in the 900 megahertz band for 30 years successfully, it seems to me that there's an extraordinarily successful experiment in the amount of innovation, the number of users, the economic value created, and the relative amount of spectrum allocated to unlicensed is minuscule. Why isn't that more of the part of the conversation? More unlicensed spectrum.
Well, I'll throw out the coach's challenge first, that there's less unlicensed than licensed. In terms of CMRS spectrum, there's more unlicensed available than there is licensed for commercial wireless. And the last two spectrum bills we've done have allocated more for unlicensed than for licensed. So I would throw out the red flag on that in terms of the availability. I think everyone understands the value of unlicensed, at least my bosses certainly do, and trying to find a mix of the two. So
No, I would agree with that. I think the report and order, 7 gigahertz of unlicensed spectrum was given out, 64 to 71 gigahertz. Granted, it's high in the band, as talked about earlier. You got limitations associated with that. But I think by and large, you're seeing across the board, whether it's low band, mid band, high band, a concerted effort by policymakers, regulators, the unlicensed community moving forward to lobby to get more unlicensed spectrum. And I would argue they've been successful.
Very successful.
And I would argue, too, that I think the whole panel and maybe the whole day has taken for granted that we have an extraordinary wireless ecosystem in this country, licensed and unlicensed. I think everybody believes that both of those models have a lot of value going forward for the country. I think we're all worried about how to preserve and continue to advance in those regards. And I think that LMS licenses for 902 to 928, if you suddenly had somebody deploying a licensed system that was stepping all over your unlicensed operations at 902 to 928, that's a problem. And that's the sort of thing I think that we've been focused on, is we're a little bit focused on the warts, even though the overall scene is a relatively positive one. Indeed, global leading. Okay, next question, ideally from a student. Ideally with not having me having to pick on someone. There's we just found some down here. Okay, who would like to ask a question?
I know our intern's got one.
All right, thank you. How fleeting these epiphanies are. Okay,
Jeff Westling, 3L. You mentioned that in part of the LTU, you were getting calls from people who you normally wouldn't get calls from. Just how much of a factor is the public opinion with these different tools that we can actually employ? Do we actually have a lot of public outcry in some of the more specific technologies? Is it something that comes up a lot, or is it kind of specific to the big button LTU type?
Oh no, Lord, if I could dump out my email from 2011, 2012 for you and show you all the people that wrote us about unlicensed, GPS and light squared. I mean, this is by no means limited to LTEU and Wi-Fi. That may be the hot button issue right now that is being raised with consumers, but it's by no means the only one. I mean, look at some of the other, and I'm going to pick on Wi-Fi, sorry guys, but like Globalstar versus Wi-Fi, right? Not raised up to the same level, but still getting calls on that. ITS versus Wi-Fi in 5.9, the other ITS, not the NTIA piece, Intelligent Transportation Systems, versus Wi-Fi in 5.9 gigahertz. We're getting a lot of calls on that. We used to get, when we were doing middle-class tax relief, the pieces that dealt with 5 gigahertz reallocation. We got a lot of folks that wanted us to reallocate, and then heard also from government users because they had their radar systems that needed to have protection. One of the rather unique things of working for Congress is that you have a publicly accessible address and people know what you work on. So we get a lot of comments on a lot of things. I know it's a real problem when it's not just me as a committee staffer that's getting these things, but when the member offices are getting phone calls, and there's a database system that each of the member offices runs that kicks out a report at the end of the day about what they got calls on. When I start getting those handouts and they've got telecom topics on them, I know we've got a problem.
Bryan, can I just?
Sure.
One thing that I don't think has been discussed today, I just throw out real briefly, is I've also noticed a sea change in the way the federal government's approaching the problem. There's a lot of credit, because when I was at the FCC, and Tom Powers up there, and when he was with the administration, I think the administration and Congress, NTIA, did a great job at really changing their focus. When I was at the FCC, sort of in 2009, 2010, you feared when you had to, there was going to be a federal agency that you're going to say, oh, can we share? Can you do something? It was just a roadblock, and it has completely changed. I mean, obviously there are going to be things that are going to be hard along the way, and for good reason. But I think in our experience with DoD, for example, which is one of the agencies in the past I think it would have been really hard to have that relationship with, there has been a huge change. I think the president made a big deal about it. Congress has really pushed those agencies, and I think that now they get how that works, and I think that's going to help make a lot of this stuff work.
Well, I think even, and by government standards, we've moved really quickly. Yes. Since 2005, we've done 5 spectrum laws, which, that's the sum total of pretty much all the spectrum laws in the 20th century. So by government standards, we moved really quickly and tried to iterate and learn, and John brought up AWS 1. That was a huge learning experience for both the commercial sector and the government side. And we saw those lessons translated into the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act. When it came to AWS 3, we heard from government users, guys, we'd really like to help you, but we can't get money to do planning exercises. We can't get money to do R&D to move our systems, so can you make the change? So last year, in the Bipartisan Budget Act, we made changes to the Federal Spectrum Relocation Fund to make it so that we could pay upfront for the government to do research into making investments in sharing and clearing in ways that weren't possible just 2 years ago. And I know Paige and I have had a lot of conversations about this. There's a lot of interest within the government in finding ways to use that money to improve spectrum use.
Because it helps everybody. And that Pipeline Act enactment last year was just huge to help the agencies do the right thing.
So exit question. So we have a lot of students in the audience and we have a lot of resources in the audience. If there was an area of academic work where you'd say it'd be great to have a paper or some research done on X to help in this area, what would it be? Rick?
I'm like either second or third.
That's why I called on you first.
I was psyched when I was in this position. I think you hit on it before, which is this notion of, you asked the perfect question of David, which is, what do you do? What do you not have, unlicensed and lots of and things? So this LTEU problem. Well, obviously, I don't think that's the right answer. Clearly, but how do you resolve that? That notion of those two competing forces at once, and then if you see the marketplace, what happens? I think that's fascinating. And if someone can find a solution, you're going to make a lot of money.
Paige?
I think from our perspective, there are multiple things, but I'll mention one in particular. There's still a lot of interest in incentives. How do you incentivize not only government users to do the right thing, whether it's enabling them to use funds for good research investments up front, or how do you incentivize non-government, non-federal users to share, as an example. But the whole idea of how can you make incentives work effectively and efficiently is a key area that I think we still need to delve into.
John?
I go back to that, automate enforcement. I think if, work on the technology aspects of enforcement, going into the 5G world of IoT and work it that way. Obviously you're going to get to a point where government's not going to be able to do it all. So you're going to have technology solutions. So got a great school here to help with that.
Clean up? Redl?
I think going back to what I said earlier, I think the most interesting paper is going to be to figure out whether SAS actually works and what about it works and how to tweak it, because it's got a lot of promise. If it works as a social and economic construct, it's got a lot of promise for enabling sharing in places where you ordinarily would not be able to.
When is the right time to start thinking about writing that paper? How long did they get before they get to write it? This is back to my time question I asked Paige earlier, but I think it's a really tough question.
I love this. I get to answer this and Preston has to listen. This is great.
Even leaning in.
I think you've probably got 2 years before we really can draw any real conclusions from SAS. I think you've got a good 2 years before getting consumers interested in devices, getting the carriers to build it into their business models is going to really play out.
Very good. With that, a round of applause for our panel. Thank you.
So we're going to move straight ahead into the wrap-up panel. Let's take a 5-minute break just to get everybody
5-minute break.
situated.
Not the 35-minute break.
And so the last panel will be the moderators and Dale talking about what this all means. The green room is no longer available.